Thanks so much.
You need anything else? You
I
good?
think I'm okay. Next time when you set up, let's pull the table in a little bit so we can.
Tell me more. Because I brought me.
A little bit more, so that people on this side feel a little further. And line the tables up with the entrance of the door. So the same width as that. Not a big deal, but thank you. I would think so. I hope so. Yeah. Right. But that side and this side don't feel as close together as I think I'd like us to feel. It's no big deal. Right. When are you going back?
This afternoon, I stayed. Very interesting. Two of them mentioned flow lights. And I happened to get a whole point. Operator possible it's a very, very talks about cognitive issues because I'm very
It's nice to be acquainted with a guy who we're going to hear
Yeah.
You don't get it. Well, this is the great thing about it. In general, what about the death scene or the death scene where again it's all and you know they're very close to one another. We saw the men who were very but that's got to be a rule from
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Nice to see everybody here and those who are live streaming. I've got a little bit of sad news for us. Naomi Singer passed away last night after decline of a long time. And I was with her yesterday and with her family, and I reminded them that, and I just reminded myself now, when I said Shabbat Shalom and everybody continued talking to one another, that Naomi, if that were to happen, she would clap her hands and say Shabbat Shalom to bring all of us together. So we remember her with a great deal of fondness. As is our custom, let's just pause for a minute of silence and remember Naomi. Okay. So, a couple of preliminaries. In terms of schedule, we will meet next week on the 18th, and then we will not meet for the subsequent 2 weeks, December 25th and January 1st, and then we'll continue again on January 8th. I also want to make a kind of a personal comment. Over the last couple of weeks, a couple of people have written to me after our Torah study sessions and said, did what I say, speaking for themselves, insult you? And I have the feeling that some people sometimes think that in the heat of our discussions, when we're exploring together, that sometimes people sense that maybe what they've said has insulted me. And here's my response. There's no way you could insult me. I mean, if you stood up and called me a bad name, I suppose that might border on it. But, hey, we're in this together, and we're exploring. And, I always refer to the idea that we don't know that we've gone too far until we go too far. It's worth working with an idea. And if one feels, or the group feels, however this works out, that, this is just too wild, it was worth doing, because we just don't know to what degree we can expand on the implications of an idea unless we dare to go what turns out to be too far. And even if we feel we've gone too far, some of us may still feel that this has cogency. So let's please don't worry about me, and let's not worry about one another either in terms of how we're going to manage our discussions, because we're dealing with the greatest literature. And it has something to say to us about our lives, and we'd like to know what. Okay, we've been working on that a long time. Okay, blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through his commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so today we move to the second of Kant's four questions. What ought I to do? Ethics in the Bible. I have to confess that this is the very first time in all the years that I've looked at the Bible that I've ever begun to consider the ethics of the Bible in its own terms, and to get some understanding of just what kind of ethics the Bible is dealing with. For example, is there a system or a set of ethics independent of law, independent of divine command, we say in the Bible? Or is the ethics of the Bible essentially the laws of the Bible, a divine command theory? That our obligation emerges from the commandment of God, and we take these ethical ideas as God's commands, and there is no independent moral set of ideas independent from law. Or is there an independent moral set of ideas or code? And if so, where does it come from? Is it contained in law? Or is it independent of law? If it's independent of law, does it derive from something like natural law? That if we just look out and see how nature works, we can infer particular ethical admonitions? Is it a function of reason independent of command? So the whole issue of ethics in the Bible is complex. I've never thought about it systematically. We certainly have laws in the 5 books of Moses, but we have ethics in the wisdom literature in Proverbs. This is not delivered to us as commands. I'm going to try to show that there are ethical norms implicit in the narrative portions of the Bible, in the stories, which are not delivered to us, so to speak, through command. So this is a very complex matter, and I'm trying to find my way just as you are in this. So who knows what we're going to come up with, but I'm glad to be involved in this adventure. So you can see I brought several things this morning to read to us, just to try to get our hands around this question of ethics in the Bible. So, first of all, I want to read from an interesting book by Lewis Newman, who teaches at Carleton College. The title of the book is Past Imperatives, a very evocative title, with the subtitle, Studies in the History and Theory of Jewish Ethics. Let me just read what he says here at the beginning. Among ethicists, that is those who think about this topic, it is commonplace to distinguish between applied and theoretical issues in ethics, sometimes marked by the terms morals and ethics, respectively. Applied work in ethics is prescriptive in nature, do's and don'ts, do this or don't do this, prescriptive. Its aim is to provide moral guidance, to offer positions on specific moral issues, and to persuade readers that these positions are worth adopting. To the general public, ethics means precisely this effort to answer practical questions. Is abortion right or wrong? Under what circumstances can a terminal patient be disconnected from life support equipment? When are we justified to use force, individually or as a society, to defend our interests? How should we make decisions involving triage when we have the means to help some but not all of those in need? These questions are hardly new. Indeed, within classical Jewish sources, we can find comments and sometimes extended discussions of these matters dating back at least to Talmudic times. In recent years, there has been a rapidly growing literature in the area of Jewish normative ethics. Normative equals prescriptive. Following the trend in society at large, new moral dilemmas, many of them related to recent dramatic developments in the area of biomedical technology, have forced upon us a range of new moral problems. A great number of books and articles addressing these moral problems have been written by Jewish authorities who speak for the tradition and interpret its teachings from a variety of perspectives. A survey of some of them, and then he points to various authors. In addition to this literature in applied ethics, do's and don'ts, how shall we behave, how shall we think, there exists a substantial literature that explores what ethicists refer to as meta-ethical or second-order questions in Jewish ethics. These are the theoretical questions that arise when we reflect on the nature of moral judgments which we make about real life in practical situations. In the context of Jewish ethics, a number of theoretical questions have been raised. How is ethics related to law? If God's commandments determine what is morally incumbent upon us, is there any role of Judaism for the autonomous, self-legislating moral agent? If ethics is the product of divine commandments, and God says do X, what role do I have as an autonomous individual to think this through, to decide whether or not and in what way I'm going to obey it? How seriously do I take it? Do I take it as prescriptive in every situation, and so on? I'm going to read this one again. You can see that now we're dealing with two different kinds of questions in the topic of ethics. Applied, is abortion right or wrong? But meta-ethical, a question about that question, how am I to understand whatever commands I might find in the text about abortion? Do I just take it automatically and apply it, or can I, in my autonomy, think it through and make some decisions on my own? You can see applied ethics, meta-ethics. Meta meaning talk about the talk. If God's commandments determine what is morally incumbent upon us, is there any role in Judaism for the autonomous, self-legislating moral agent? You may remember what Immanuel Kant says. Be your own legislator. Dare to use your own reason. We're going to free ourselves, those of us who feature reason, from being enthralled, dependent upon institutions or traditions. We're going to think it through ourselves. For Kant, ethics needs to be essentially autonomous. So is there room for a kind of autonomous feature in, and so on, going on? To what extent is Jewish ethics compatible with or comparable to other non-religious systems of ethics? Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. 2 of the 10 Commandments. You didn't need the 10 Commandments to know this. Honoring parents is something that all societies do in one way or another, or else there's no continuity. There's no tradition. Don't murder. What society cannot have don't murder in their system? Of course, murder is different from killing. The 6th commandment does not say don't kill. Otherwise, we wouldn't eat meat, and we would be like the Jainists in the Far East, and we would brush the ground in front of us as we walk so as not to kill anything. Murder, by definition, is wrongful killing, and that requires a discussion. But what society, having decided what acts of violence count as murder, once having decided that, that's not automatic. I mean, I just had a piece of chicken last night. If I felt don't kill was incumbent upon me, I wouldn't have that piece of chicken, okay? So, to what degree are Jewish ethics, let's say the ethics of the Bible, independent of or connected to general ethical principles for which the Bible is not necessary to feel its force? To what extent is Jewish ethics compatible with or comparable to other non-religious systems of ethics? Here again, theoretical questions of this sort have a long history within Judaism. Although classical rabbinic literature, by its nature, tends not to employ a philosophical idiom, and we've talked about this over and over again, even though, for example, the Bible deals with serious issues. I mean, we've known this for years. It doesn't deliver these issues in a philosophical way to search for clarity. What are the assumptions? What are the implications? Are we consistent? Is there coherence, right? This would be a philosophical way of dealing with this sort of thing. The Bible doesn't do that. It delivers it either as law, as narrative, as aphorism, and so on. Although classical rabbinic literature by its nature tends not to employ a philosophical idiom, a number of Jewish philosophers in both medieval and modern times have grappled with these questions. Okay, so that's the first thing to say about this, just to open up this topic. I want to quote now from another very interesting book by John Barton, a Christian theologian, and the book is with the title Understanding Old Testament Ethics. So let me read from his opening chapter. The Old Testament, he calls it the Old Testament, which is fine. The Old Testament's moral vision is thus more complicated than it might appear. Certainly more complicated than most people think it is. So he goes, I'm going to skip, let me read it. Basic to it, I've argued with Otto, another author, is a certain concept of human dignity, in which the choices human beings make really matter, okay? So now he's taking on the question of the role of human initiative in responding to or figuring out what ethics requires. They, human beings, are not God's puppets in a theater, whose audience is other divine beings. Think of Greek mythology, think of the role of the gods in the great epics. I'm going to start that sentence again. They are not God's puppets in a theater whose audience is other divine beings with their own concerns to which humans are irrelevant. They are instead, human beings, partners with the single God in the only drama God is interested in. I love that. We don't get anything about God's activities in heaven, with whom God consorts, for example, what God is thinking about in terms of God's own life. God is involved in what goes on here on earth among human beings through history. They are instead, human beings, partners with the single God and the only drama God is interested in, the drama played out on earth by created beings. This concept gives the human race both a greater glory and a greater responsibility than it usually had in the cultures that surrounded Israel. It is not subject to random divine acts, and hence need not live fatalistically. On the other hand, human beings, are accountable for our own sins, which cannot be laid at the door of some malevolent divine power. Hence, both the hope and the fear we encounter in the prophets. Hope, because good moral choices are worth making. They are not nullified by an indifferent universe containing malign powers who snuff us out at will. That's another way of looking at the universe. And it just occurred to me, this famous quote in King Lear, I think by Gloucester, I'm going to quote it. As flies to wanton boys are we for the gods. They kill us for their sport. That's that view, which Barton is saying is not the view of the scriptures. Okay? A very different worldview in which human action matters. The prophets, I'm going back to this, for prophets hope, because good moral choices are worth making. They are not nullified by an indifferent universe containing malign powers who snuff us out at will, but also for the prophets fear, because wrong choices ensure bad consequences, and the anger of a God who cannot be bought off. But alongside its high moral tone, the Old Testament is also aware of the ways in which even good human actions can go sour, as reflected in the realism of its classic narrative texts. These texts achieve a certain tour de force, combining a belief in God's moral government of the world and the importance of good human judgment with Ecclesiastes' awareness that time and chance happen to all. Both Judaism and Christianity have inherited that combination, and neither finds it easy to live with. How great is that? God rules the world, so to speak, with a kind of a coherent moral consciousness. And that our lives are not fully subject to the accidents, to what's the word I'm looking for? Caprice. And so we can count on some lawfulness in the world and some relevance of a moral system to our well-being. Our actions matter. But also time and chance happen to all. And that there are imponderables in our life, and we can't answer fully the question, why did this happen to me? Or why did this happen to my loved one? So there is both a commitment to moral coherence as well as a recognition that it doesn't always seem to apply. Okay? So I think what Barton has done here is he's given some context to the whole question of ethics. Let me read here from Eugene Borowitz, one of the major Jewish theologians in the Reformed Jewish world, the book with the title Exploring Jewish Ethics, Papers on Covenant Responsibility. I'm going to read here from one of his earlier essays. For the biblical author, human responsibility derives from God's reality. Okay? I wish Alan were here to take that on. One God and no other creature created the universe, set its rules, oversees its affairs, and participates in its activities in both ordinary and extraordinary ways. That's a long sentence. I want to read it again. One God and no other created the universe, set its rules, oversees its affairs, and participates in its activities in both ordinary and in extraordinary ways. This sovereign yet involved God, sovereign but not aloof, this sovereign yet involved God created humankind different from other creatures, making people uniquely capable of knowing and doing God's will. Remarkably, the undisputed ruler of the universe gave human beings the freedom to do or not do the divine commands. The ethics of Judaism begins at this juncture. A God who might but does not coerce persons, and a person created for special intimacy with God who may freely will to obey or transgress God's stated will. God's dare. I could have it my way. I could compel compliance. But I think I'll give human beings free will and take my chances. And God is regularly surprised and upset. The distinctive urgency connected with the Bible's injunctions to action stems not only from there being God's stated behests, but from the knowledge that God cares supremely about human action. Diverse human metaphors are employed to make the divine priorities plain. God weeps. Now here comes a series of emotions that God expresses in his disappointment with what we do. God weeps, pants, suffers, roars, regrets, rages, threatens, punishes, and much else, in response to humankind's freely chosen sinfulness. God's concerns embrace much more than what the Greeks considered ethics, for example, the interdiction of idolatry. Nonetheless, moral considerations occupy a major place in the biblical legislation and are a constant theme in the historical books, run strongly through the wisdom literature, and dominate the prophetic condemnations of the people. Classic Judaism summons humankind and the Jewish people to action for God's sake. One can only hope to understand its character and the ethics it encompasses if one appreciates the manifold religious levels on which its teaching is communicated and experienced. So let's see here. The ethical thrust, now he's talking about covenant. No, I want to go back. One other aspect of the ethical theory of human nature deserves attention. For the biblical authors and the rabbis, human nature remains critically social. One is indissoluble, not only with one's family, but with one's folk or nation. Thus, the classic ethics of Judaism address the community or society as much as the individuals who constitute them. So seamlessly do these notions blend, individual and community, that often in the books of Psalms, we cannot tell whether an individual or the nation speaks or is being addressed. And occasionally the poet moves between the two with no apparent unease. So too, the traditional ethics of Judaism manifests an utter interpenetration of what might elsewhere be distinct domains of individual and social ethics. The ethical thrust of the covenant with the Jews hardly comes as a surprise, given the biblical view of God and humankind. It urges Jews to be just with others, and yet more than just. A repetitive theme in the commandments demands special concern for the powerless, the widow, the stranger, the orphan. Notice that what he's talking about now is not just particular commands or ethical principles, but a kind of culture, a kind of norm that can't be reduced to commands, a sense of empathy with the powerless. You can't command empathy. You can make commands which generate or reinforce empathy. So there is beyond the particulars something more general, something less articulable, the culture of a people. So too community must take care of the poor, not to the point of perverting justice for them. One may also not pervert justice for the rich, but in acknowledging the right of the indigent to community support. Such laws, so to speak, command compassion, seeking to make personal response as urgent a responsibility as obedience to specified duties. For God's justice and mercy can never be completely spelled out. And the fullest service of God must come through living up to one's personal likeness to God. Don't you think this is rich? The pervasiveness of an ethical set of principles and concern, but somehow the particulars cannot fully encompass what the whole does. Okay, so I now want to quote really a fascinating book by Alistair McIntyre, who I think teaches at Notre Dame, or did teach at Notre Dame, where Doris taught. He's done a lot of wonderful, wonderful work. McIntyre is very concerned about the way ethics has been developed since the Enlightenment, and as particular kind of do's and don'ts, self-enclosed. So this is a book with the title, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. And the three versions are encyclopedia, genealogy, and tradition. Encyclopedia is essentially a view that we make progress in terms of knowledge and morals as history goes on, and that the past is prologue, and each present is an advance over the past. Because all knowledge is one, and all moral principles are one, and we're just trying to get them all expressed. An encyclopedia, when you think about it, is based on the sense that I can encompass in a finite number of volumes all that is known. Genealogy is essentially Nietzsche, who worries about just that kind of thing, that what we claim to know, what we claim is right, is always a disguise for the will to power, that behind any system are the interests of those who devise the system. And Nietzsche engages in what we might, in a kind of highfalutin way, call the hermeneutics of suspicion. We're going to suspect everything we read. Plato is not to be read as drawing out and dramatizing the whole notion of absolute norms and absolute entities. But Plato is interested in creating a system which enhances and secures the power of a certain social class. That's what it's all about, okay? And tradition is what it suggests, that these things ought to be understood within traditions. So I want to read a couple of things from this wonderful book. If you're interested in a very fascinating study, Thomas Aquinas figures very, very prominently in this book, as he does, I think, in McIntyre's earlier book, After Virtue. All right, so in case you want to check me on these things, I'm quoting now from page 79. What is the telos, the goal, the aim of human beings? See, that's a good question. When we engage in our activities, are we engaging in a random set of activities? On Monday, I do X, Y, and Z, and then I go to bed, and I get up in the morning, and I do A, B, and C on Tuesday. And then I do D, E, and F on Wednesday. What's it all about? Am I striving for anything, or am I just trying to make it through my day? Is there a kind of aim, of a goal, that human beings ought to strive for? Aristotle's idea is that since we are rational beings, and that is what distinguishes rational animals. In other words, in the genus, in the category of animals, we are a subset. We are animals as well. But what distinguishes us is our reason. And what distinguishes us as a species within a genus is therefore that aspect which our life ought to cultivate and develop in an extreme way. The more rational we are, the more we're controlled by our reason, the more human, now in the normative sense. I'm a human being, but am I really human? Did you happen to see a little bit of the funeral for Bob Dole yesterday and Tom Dashiell's eulogy? Anybody see that? Where he said that what really ought to be the final description of Bob Dole is that he was a human being. Humanity mattered to him, as opposed to, say, mere partisanship. And so on. So the question is, do we human beings have a goal? And if we do, shouldn't we try to understand the nature of that goal and how to get there? So McIntyre is now raising that question. What is and by the way, the answer might be nothing. We're just animals who come into the world, and we live our days, and we try to do the best we can. And there's no overarching norm or value or purpose to what it is to be human. What does it tell us of human beings? What is right action? If we do, what is right action directed toward that purpose? That's the right question. If I can decide that I do have a purpose in life, if Aristotle is right. By the way, to be fair to Aristotle, he talks about both the rational virtues and the moral virtues. So it's not enough. It's a problem in Aristotle's ethics. Because does finally morals become subordinate to reason, or do the moral virtues have a kind of independent status? And one can read the Nicomachean Ethics in both ways. But let's follow McIntyre here. What is right action directed toward that? If I know my goal, what action should I take to achieve it? What are the virtues which issue in right action? If I cultivate the virtue of humility, I'm going to be acting in certain ways in certain situations. So the virtues are features of my character, the kind of enduring attributes that I have. And if I'm going to act correctly, shouldn't I cultivate the virtues which lead to right actions? My favorite example is say please and thank you. When we were kids, that's what our parents said to us when somebody did something nice. Say thank you. Why should I? You're forcing me to say thank you? Yes. Because if you say thank you and please over and over again, you will cultivate the character, the virtue of kindness or of gratitude. And from that virtue, from that characteristic of your character, you're bound in subsequent situations to act that way. So if I have a goal in life, if what it means to be human has a certain goal, and I ask the question, what are the actions, now we're dealing with ethics, that lead to that goal? And then if I ask, well, how can I cultivate the right actions? And an answer, an Aristotelian answer is, to cultivate the virtues, the features of character, which lead to the right actions, which will lead to fulfilling your purpose as a human being. And that's a question any consideration of the ethics of a system has to ask. What is the Bible's idea of the track on which we live our lives if we're alert to possibility? I'm going to start this again. What does the telos of human beings? What is right action directed toward the telos? What are the virtues which issue in right action? What are the laws which order human relationships so that men and women may possess those virtues? And so on. To live a practically well-ordered life is to embody the universal concepts which we comprehend and justify, and so on and so on. Let me go on with it. This is a little complicated, but I think it's worth it. So the moral life is the life of embedded moral inquiry. My goal, the actions that lead to the goal, the virtues that lead to the actions, the laws that lead to the virtues, and so on. And law is a function of society. So if I'm going to be on the track of leading the best human life I can, I must do it in an embedded situation. Not me as an individual all by myself, but an individual embedded in a kind of story, in a kind of social norm, which itself facilitates this road to virtues, to actions, to purpose. You can see that this is the beginning of McIntyre's discussion on the power of tradition, which guides us, but not just so we could do what our ancestors did. Why should I do it? Because your ancestors did it. That may be true, but that's not ultimately what it's about. You should do it because it leads you to perfection. So the moral life is the life of embedded moral inquiry. I'm going to illustrate this in a minute in the Bible itself. And those individuals who live out the moral life as farmers or fishermen or furniture makers, he didn't say scholars or artists, every people leading the everyday lives, in terms of the crafts, embody more or less adequately in those lives, devoted in key part to their own crafts, what may not often be recognized as a theory, the product of the theorist's very different craft, but which nevertheless is one. It embodies a theory. And the particularities of such lives in a variety of significant ways embody and continue the traditions, moral, religious, and intellectual, of such communities as those of the family, the city, the clan, and the nation. Thus, political narratives of success or failure in the making and sustaining of such communities are also inescapably narratives of embodied moral inquiry. It's in communities that our moral quest is best lived out. Okay, so do I want to read anything else from him? Yeah, let me see. Okay, very good. I guess I did it. Let's go on. Modern moral philosophy, Kant, Mill, Sidgwick, and so on. Modern moral philosophy has in general been blind to the complementary character of narrative and theory. That is, you can't just have theory in an isolated way. It has to be contained in a narrative, in a story. And a story is about the interaction of people with one another and circumstance. And this is the problem with Kant. For Kant, the criterion of a good moral action is logical consistency. I can't make a maxim for myself, something which leads to contradiction. And that's a self-enclosed argument. That's not a part of a larger community. Modern moral philosophy has in general been blind to the complementary character of narrative and theory, both in moral inquiry and the moral life itself. In moral inquiry, we are always concerned with the question, what type of enacted narrative would be the embodiment of this particular theory? If I have a theory about what it means to be human, what sort of story, what sort of narrative promotes it? For until we have answered this question about narrative, we do not know what that theory in fact amounts to. Okay, so this notion of an embodied narrative. And now I want to look at Rashi. We know Rashi, the most famous medieval commentator on the Bible. And his commentary on the first verses of Leviticus 19. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And see the way in which a particular moral admonition, honor your father and mother, is not taken in isolation, but in connection with other considerations. You see the idea here? So when we're dealing with biblical ethics, as far as McIntyre is concerned, we have to deal with it in some context or another, and not as isolated pieces of law or morals. And now I'm going to use Rashi to say this. So, here's the passage that he is commenting on. You shall every man fear his mother. This is Bible, chapter 19, verse 3. You shall every person fear, every man fear his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord. Okay? So that's a pretty rich line. Every man and woman will fear the Lord and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord. What does that amount to? Now Rashi is going to treat this as a sequence, as a kind of mini narrative. And here's Rashi. Every man shall revere his mother and father. Fear. This, Rashi says, is the literal sense. The halachic explanation, the explanation in the Jewish rabbinic tradition is that since Scripture says ish, man, I have here only the law that a man must fear his father and his mother. How do I know this also applies to a woman? That's Rashi's question. Because Scripture states the verb tira'u, plural. Since it does, it starts with singular, man, but then the verb is plural. So how do you reconcile this? It is evident, Rashi goes on to say, therefore, that it speaks here of two, man and woman. Okay, so that really when I think about what's going on here, though it says man, it really means man and woman, son and daughter. But Rashi goes on to say, if this is so, why then does it use the term man at all? Because it is the man who has the means to do it, while the woman is under the control of others, dependent upon her husband. Now, obviously, that's anachronistic for us. But what Rashi is dealing with here are the givens of that particular culture. And so it's important to say both man and woman, both daughter and son, but also to recognize that only one of them in this kind of society has the wherewithal to implement this. Okay, now, so every man and woman shall fear his mother and father. Here Scripture mentions the mother before the father because it is manifest to God that the child fears the father more than the mother. Wait till your father comes home, right? That idea. That the child fears the father, fear or revere, more than the mother, and therefore by mentioning the mother first with regard to fear, Scripture stresses the duty of fearing her as well. In the case of honoring parents, now the fifth commandment in the Ten Commandments back in Exodus 20, kabed et avicha ve'et imecha, you shall honor your father and your mother, reversed. In the case of honoring parents, however, Scripture mentions the father before the mother because it's manifest that the child honors the mother more than the father because she endeavors to win him over with kindly words. Don't be too harsh on him. Okay, that sort of thing. Therefore, by mentioning the father first, Scripture emphasizes the duty of honoring him. Natural inclination, and so on. Now, Scripture places the commandment of observing the Sabbath immediately after that of fearing one's father in order to suggest the following. Let me just read the verse again just to be sure we know what he's saying. So, verse 3 of the Bible, you shall fear every person, his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths, I am the Lord. Scripture places the commandment of observing the Sabbath immediately after that of fearing one's father in order to suggest the following. Although I admonish you regarding the fear due to your father and mother, yet if your father bids you to desecrate the Sabbath, don't listen to him. And the same is the case with any of the commandments. In other words, honor your father and mother. Revere your father and mother. Okay, whatever my father says goes because I'm supposed to fear my father. It's an absolute. No, it is not. And that's why the next statement is the Sabbath. Although I admonish you regarding the fear due to your father, yet if he bids you desecrate the Sabbath, don't listen to him. And the same is the case with any of the other commandments. This, it is evident, is the meaning since Scripture adds, I am the Lord your God. Both you and your father are equally bound to honor me. Do not, therefore, obey him if it results in making my, capital M, my words of no effect. You see what Rashi has done here? In the name of the rabbis, so this is quoting various rabbinic pieces of literature, that we have a kind of narrative here. It's a narrative of moving from the raw command of fearing your parents to making it complementary to honor, so to bring in both motivations, both kinds of action, revere and fear, or honor and fear, but then it places it in a context, a larger context, which, without undermining the command to revere and fear, it contextualizes it. It places it within the commandments, and therefore within the norms of the larger community, all of which is under the authority of God. So we have individual, concentric circles, individual, family, community, God. And we have now a system of normative ethics in which no single admonition can be absolutized. It all has to take place in a kind of context. And we have some famous examples in the Middle Ages of parents who have said to their children, don't marry, you can't marry her. And of a boy going to his rabbi and saying, well, what about that? And the rabbi allows the boy to marry. Or the more famous example where the father on his deathbed says to his son, don't ever speak to Poloni again, because Poloni and I were enemies, and I command you never to speak to him. And he goes to his rabbi, and the rabbi says that your father can't command you this, and therefore do not follow his words. And so this set of concentric circles is now playing out in, this is my point of doing it, it's a mini narrative of its own, but it plays out in the context of the narrative of society. Okay, so don't let me go on if you have some questions or concerns or, God forbid, disagreements. Just kidding about that. Okay. What about purpose? The purpose of human action. Now I want to just quote from Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. And this is part 3, chapter 27. The Torah, he said, it's translated law here, but law is too narrow. The Torah, the teaching, as a whole, aims at two things. So Maimonides is directly taking on the question of what's the whole point of this? Is it just bits of behavior? God said do X, do it. Why should I? Don't ask. Yes, ask. Why should I do it? What's it for? The Torah as a whole, by Torah now he means not just Bible, but the teaching of Judaism that expands from the biblical origin. The welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. So that the Torah, what's interesting here is that Maimonides is being quite Aristotelian here. For Aristotle, the goal of human life is eudaimonia. We might translate it happiness, but it's more than happiness. It's flourishing. That's what ethics is for human flourishing. That's what Maimonides is saying here as well. The welfare of the soul, the flourishing of the soul, and the flourishing of the body. As for the welfare of the soul, it consists in the multitudes, not just the scholars, the multitudes acquiring correct opinions corresponding to their respective capacity. To have the right ideas, which is the cultivation of the welfare of the mind. Therefore, some of them, namely the opinions, are set forth explicitly, and some of them are set forth in parables, right? I mean, just to say it explicitly may not engage the attention of everybody, so you tell it as a story. Or the prophets, you feel the pathos of the prophet's commitment, and it draws you to what the prophet is trying to teach us. For it is not within the nature of the common multitude that its capacity should suffice for apprehending the subject matter as it is. Okay, so here's Maimonides' elitism. But he's making an interesting point here. The method by which the truths are conveyed is equally important to the truths themselves. You want to ask yourself, and any teacher has to ask him or herself, how can I best convey what I have in mind? And one vehicle for teachers is the blackboard. I want to talk about the properties of a circle. So I draw a circle on the blackboard. That no circle ever drawn on the blackboard is a real circle. The definition of a circle is let me see if I can say that, the locus of a point that is equidistant from a given point. That's a circle. Every point on the circle is equidistant from the point at the center. No circle ever put on a blackboard models that, right? These are all images of a circle. But it's good to use it because this is a vehicle for teaching those who can't deal with the definition of a circle and its various properties, okay? So that the method of, and that's what one of the great things about the Torah, or for that matter, the Gospels, right? I mean, they deliver their message in stories and parables and so on. For it is not within the nature of the common multitude, its capacity to suffice and so on. As for the welfare of the body, it comes about by the improvement of their ways of living with one another. Social progress. This is achieved through two things. One of them is the abolition of their wronging each other. This is tantamount to every individual among the people not being permitted to act according to his will or up to the limits of his power, but being forced to do what is useful to the whole. No sentence is as appropriate for our day as that sentence. The second thing consists in the acquisition by every human individual of moral qualities that are useful for life in society, so that the affairs of the city may be ordered. Now know that between these two aims, one is indubitably greater in nobility, namely the welfare of the soul, I mean the procuring of correct opinions, while the second aim, I mean the welfare of the body, is prior in nature and in time, right? You ought to cultivate the welfare of the body. Let's not harm each other, and let's get the moral virtues that make it felicitous for us to live together. Although, if we cultivate our minds, that's the higher and more noble, but it can't come first. The latter consists in the governance of the city and the well-being of the states, of all its people, according to their capacity. This second aim is the more certain one, and it is the one regarding which every effort has been made by me, by Maimonides, to expound it, all the rules and the laws, and all its particulars. For the first aim, the higher aim, can only be achieved after achieving the second one. So if the goal of human beings is to acquire a kind of perfection, cultivation of our capacities to their extreme extent, then that consists of two things: the welfare of the body, the welfare of the soul. The welfare of my body and the welfare of the social body is a necessary condition for achieving my true aim, which is the accomplishment of full knowledge. Along the way, it's a philosophical view, but along the way, Maimonides has given us to understand what the embedded narrative is all about, what the story is all about. The creation of a social order in which human beings as individuals can flourish. Okay, so just trying to draw out some of the issues that we are concerned with. Now, I want to read a little more of McIntyre. Now I'm going to page 193. So he's concerned here about the isolated individual and the problems. A second closely related example concerns the genesis of the distinctly moral ought, O-U-G-H-T. The variety of words translatable as ought in ancient and medieval languages never have a sense which allows them a mandatory force independently of the reasons given for uttering the statements which are to be expressed by them. No simply isolated moral commands, but always in the context at least of giving the reasons on the basis of which we ought to take them seriously. And such reasons always refer to some good of some type. An ought may have categorical force, but only it's in virtue of its place in a statement of the form, if and since to do so is best for such a specific type of person in these particular circumstances, and you are just such a person, then you ought to do so and so. Shared moral precepts or rules using this type of ought depend therefore for their authority upon there being a set of shared beliefs as to what is good and best for different types of human being. Just that kind of shared belief, which is the mark of those communities of moral inquiry and practice within which alone, he says here, on the Thomistic view, St. Thomas' view, human goods can be adequately identified. So I think, let's go on a little bit. Destroy or marginalize such forms of community and replace them with the social order of modern individualism. That is, be careful. I'm going to read that again. I'm going to parse it a little bit. If you destroy or marginalize or don't take seriously enough such forms of community, and if you dare replace them with the modern individualism and replace earlier shared forms of belief with the pluralism of indefinite and growing disagreement, modern pluralism, modern relativism. Hey, don't question me on this. This is my opinion. This is what I believe. And you believe something different. Well, let's try to adjudicate between the two. We can't do it. We're just left with a chaos of individual preferences. That's that idea here. I'm going to start this again. If you destroy or marginalize such forms of community and replace them with modern individualism, or if you replace earlier shared forms of belief with the pluralism of indefinite and growing disagreement as to what the goods of human beings are and how or whether they are to be hierarchically ordered, whether there's a system of beliefs, but retain as a shared possession most, if not all, of the inherited moral precepts and rules. Such rules will be consequence, deprived of their if and since antecedents and so on and so on. Okay, so why don't we stop there and let's look a little bit at a biblical passage. Let's look at Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments. Okay, so let's notice several things here. One is, if the commandments themselves were of uniquely superior meaning, why wouldn't the Bible begin with them? Let me just give you the commandments. Let me just tell you how to live. Honor your father and mother, don't murder, don't commit adultery, and so on and so on. What is the case is that these commandments come in the 70th chapter of the Bible. 50 chapters of Genesis, this is chapter 20. Why? One answer to the question is because the commandments are embedded in a story. They're not just to be taken in an isolated way. So what is the story that leads to the Ten Commandments? Let's talk about that a little bit. What are the components of the story that lead to the Ten Commandments? What are they?
Trial and error.
I'm sorry?
Trial and error.
Trial and error. Very good, very good. And especially chapters 1 through 11, in which human beings fail over and over and over again, though God is somehow still, through it all, committed to humanity and its possibilities. Okay, trial and error. What else? Harry? Do's and don'ts. So there are moral imperatives in the narrative sections, okay? And we already have in chapter 16 of Exodus the Shabbat commandment, so we have some do's and don'ts. Jim?
You've got a group that's leaving a tyrannical system that have no organizations. They have no, they're chaotic.
Yeah.
They know they're leaving, but for what?
Okay. Oh, so you're not talking about the Egyptian system. You're talking about the travel in the wilderness once they leave.
Yeah, they've been under a, for good or bad, a tyrannical system where everything is just decreed and that's what you do, and they don't like it. So, but now, okay, so we didn't like that, we're not gonna do it, but what are we gonna do?
There you go. There you go. So that they achieve, is Isaiah Berlin's Two Types of Liberty essay, where he talks about freedom from and freedom to, negative freedom and positive freedom. So by leaving Egypt, they've achieved negative freedom, freedom from bondage. But freedom from bondage is not yet all that we need. We need the freedom to, let me finish that sentence, live our lives in ways that make sense to us, given our worldview. Okay? And that comes at Sinai. So that here, trial and error, do's and don'ts, freedom from bondage, and what's going to happen next is the story in which the Ten Commandments are given. Okay? Another given is that this is a theistic universe, that God is in the universe. God has created the universe in certain ways, and we've talked about those from chapter 1. And God is concerned about the well-being of humanity. And in his trial and error, he does certain things, right? He makes a covenant with Noah. I'm not going to destroy the earth again. Then he finds that that's not exactly all that you need. Then he calls Abraham, through you shall all the nations of the earth, God's universalism through a particular instrument. And then God does something else. God establishes covenant. So let's look at a couple of the covenant passages, because the Ten Commandments law works in the context of a relationship between God and human beings. So let's look at chapter 17 of Genesis. We've looked at that before, but now let's take a look at it again. Genesis 17, verse 3. Avram threw himself on his face, and God spoke to him further. As for me, this is my covenant with you. Now, who's the you here? Avram. Who's Avram? The father of a multitude. So Abraham here represents in advance the community, the nation. You shall be the father of a multitude of nations, and you shall no longer be called Avram, but your name shall be Avraham. For I make you the father of a multitude. I'll make you exceedingly fertile. I'll make nations of you. Here's God's part of the covenant, what I'm going to do for you. And kings shall come forth from you. I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages. I've committed to you absolutely to be God to you and to your offspring to come. I assign the land you sojourn in to you and your offspring to come, all the land of Canaan, as a brit olam, an everlasting holding, and I will be their God. God further said to Abraham, as for you, here comes the second half of the covenant, which makes it a bilateral covenant now. Obligations on the part of both parties. As for you, you and your offspring to come throughout the ages shall keep my covenant. Such shall be the covenant between me and you. And that's circumcision. And we talked last week, I think, about why circumcision is an especially appropriate, powerful first commandment given to Abraham. Let's look at Exodus chapter 6. Verse 2. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I'm the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, didn't make myself known to them by my name, Adonai. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land which they now live as sojourners. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. And by implication, this is my extension, you need to remember it too. I'm remembering it, you need to. Say therefore to the Israelites, I'm the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and through extraordinary chastisements, I'll take you to be my people. I will be your God, and you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. In other words, the people, this again is my inference, maybe you'll disagree with it, the people are not yet up to their part of it. And thus enters into the picture education, the role of education. Some of you know Michael Walzer's great book, Exodus and Revolution, in which he says, Moses' great achievement is the 40 years wandering. That's Moses' achievement. You remember at the golden calf incident, Moses asked his assistants, strap on your swords and let's go out and kill all the dissidents. A revolution. Let's get rid of the problem immediately. And Moses quickly recognized that that was not adequate. And therefore he needed a longer process through which to train and to educate the people. And according to Walzer, not only is this Moses' great achievement, but in a certain sense, the heroes of the 40 years wandering is the people themselves. They stay with the project. Yeah, there are some reactionaries who want to go back, but the people trudge on to the promised land. Let's then look now at chapter 19. Exodus 19, yeah. So, they are now arriving at Mount Sinai. This is the big moment. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. I was myself there. I was solicitous to you, my people, and carried you as a mother carries her young. And I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, that eagles carry their young on their backs and therefore make themselves vulnerable to the arrows from below. Now then, back to verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, now this is the statement of the role, the need, the responsibility of the Israelites, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Notice this notion of the prophet's hope and fear, that it's incumbent upon the prophet's hope that human beings can do better, but they fear that if they fail to do better, they will be punished. And so the responsibility is acute. And this is what God is saying to them. If, this is a hypothetical, if it's not that you are my treasured possession because something about you or something about me, this is all contingent upon proper behavior. A good preface to law. Law is a fulfillment of covenant as part of an ongoing story. Now if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A very pregnant phrase, isn't it? Priests are the leaders of the people. A kingdom of priests are the leaders of the peoples. You shall be a certain set of leaders and holy, aspiring to excellence. Let's just put it that way. Holy means two things: separate and noble, distinct, right? These are the words you shall speak to the children of Israel. Okay, so you see some of the things that we've looked at this morning, the Borowitz, the McIntyre, about how to understand the nature, the power, the function of biblical ethics can't just be understood by looking at a certain set of commands and trying to understand what each means in its own terms. But these are all contributions to the wheel of W-E-A-L, of the community, and need to be understood in terms of the community norm and the purpose of community, Maimonides, the welfare of the body and the welfare of the soul. Now, in the couple of minutes that we have, let's just look at the Ten Commandments. So, there's a controversy about chapter 20, verse 2. God spoke all these words, saying, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Then, according to the Jewish tradition, the Palestinian Jewish tradition, not the Greek Jewish tradition, I think that Josephus and Philo don't have this as the first commandment. And it's plausible not to. It's not a commandment. It's a statement. It's a preface. Okay? So, let's think of it as a preface. Is it a necessary preface? What's its function? I'm sorry?
It's a whereas. It's setting this condition.
Yeah, right. Whereas I did certain things for you, namely, let's think of covenant, folks. Moses is saying through God to the people, that God did these things for you, and now, having done this for you, you have some obligations by way of reciprocity. Okay? So it's the summary of the story. How might we talk about the story in one sentence? Here's an idea. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. What's the argument? There's an argument here between Maimonides and Nachmanides. I can't remember who takes what view. Let's suppose Maimonides takes the view we just talked about. It's a preface. And let's say Nachmanides thinks of it as a commandment. What's the argument for taking it as a commandment? I'm sorry? It's declaring his authority, exactly. Not I am the Lord your God, but I am to be the Lord your God. And therefore, all the subsequent commandments are now based upon God's authority. Let's pause there. What about authority? So there's a nice midrash that says something like this. A king conquers a city. And he goes to them and he says, now you have to obey me. And they say, well, why should we? And so the king recognizes the value of that response. And so he fixes their roads and he repairs the walls and he brings fresh water into the community. And then he goes to them and says, you are to obey me. And they say, now we get it. You have done some things for us. And this establishes the grounds of your authority to prescribe. That's a powerful midrash, isn't it? Which I think is a very interesting reading of this first verse. This is not a power play on God's part. I created you, obey me or else. This is an argument based upon God's being faithful to God's own covenant, God's relationship to the people. You were in bondage, I brought you out. Since I did that for you, now you have an obligation which makes sense. It's rational. I don't want to overstate the rational because the rational is not the final arbiter very often or even much. But here it might be. Let me ask you, let's just take a little vote on this. Verse 2, we have two choices. It's a prologue and not a commandment. That's choice 1. Choice 2, it's a commandment. Let's everybody, if you want to play along with me on this, make a choice. I'm going to have to think about it myself. Yeah. I don't know. All right, I'll make a choice. How many think it's a prologue? I'm sorry?
Verse 2 alone.
Verse 2 alone.
Okay.
Verse 2 alone. Prologue. How many think of it as a commandment? Oh, come on. That's great. That's great. I guess I'm sort of in the prologue camp too. Although, think about it. If it's a commandment, it contains what the prologue might be. I am to be your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Jeff?
I have a question. I thought I read somewhere once that there was a midrash that only the first 2 sentences came down with Moses, and everything else is the interpolation of the author, which might make this a slightly different. When it's a prologue, it's what Moses brought down was 1 to
Commandments 1 and 2? Or
commandments, whatever they are.
Uh-huh.
And then everything else, don't kill, don't do this, don't do that. Am I making that up? I thought I've learned this at some point.
Yeah. When you started describing this midrash, a different midrash occurred to me. You might be confusing this with this midrash I'm about to say, and you might not. You might not be wrong. Notice that through verse 7, that's not right. There is something here. The midrash that I recall, I have to go back to it, is that the first 2 commandments were stated in the presence of the people. And then if we look quickly at verse 15 of chapter 20. All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said, and we will obey, but don't let God speak to us lest we die. So, at a certain point, here in the plain reading of the text, they got terrified and left at the end of the Ten Commandments. The Midrash I'm referring to, and I can't remember how they get it, is that this fear took place at the end of the second commandment, and they didn't hear the rest of the commandments themselves, but they were given to Moses. All of the commandments are given, so we have two different versions of this Midrash. I'm pretty sure the one that I have is a Midrash. I'm not sure that yours is not. Yeah. Charlotte?
How about it's a sense of identity? It separates us from everybody else.
Very good, very good. So in other words, in McIntyre's sense, there is no one general human story. There are many stories, and each community has its story. In other words, on the question of the truth or a truth, we might say, see, Plato is interested in the truth. The ideas, the real values and entities are up there in a transcendent realm, and each of us can come to understand it in our own way. There's one truth. McIntyre's view is there is truth, but each community has its own. We have our truths as Jews. Christians, look, I mean, even there, obviously, there are many sub-truths any community has. There are Protestants and Catholics and so on. But each community has its own truth, and that truth, here I'm going to invoke Kierkegaard again, talks about the difference between objective truth and subjective truth. For Plato, there is one truth, and it's objective. It's true. It's real. We can get to it with difficulty. For McIntyre, each community has its truth, but it's subjective. It's limited to that community. And Charlotte, what I think you're suggesting is this gives this community its truths. Now, I think the Bible would want to say that it's the truths for all communities. But just see, McIntyre's view is that the Jewish ethics is a system unto itself. It may overlap other systems, but it has an integrity, a coherence of its own. It's like my frequent image of baseball and football. Baseball has its coherence. It's a set of rules. We know how to play the game. We know when we played it wrong. We know what winning and losing means. We know when it's over. It's a very different set of rules than football. We wouldn't say that baseball rules are true, period, about all games. They're all true, only true about this game. But they are true in this game. If you want to play the game of baseball, you know what the rules are. You can make your way. At the end of the ninth inning, if one team's ahead, go home. But it's not true about it. And Charlotte is raising an interesting question. I think the Bible wants to suggest that these are the truths for all time. But one can also think of them in McIntyre's sense of the origins of a particular tradition, which has its fullness and its expansiveness and its subgroups within. And it's a different way of playing the game of life. I don't use play frivolously here. I'm sorry?
We wrote a book and called it Your KFO.
See, that's more clearly a Jewish book only, whereas the Bible is not clearly in its intention a Jewish book only. In the beginning,
God created the heavens and the earth. The beginning of what? Of everything. And so this book is about everything and everybody. If it wanted to be just a book for a certain community, it would have started with chapter 12. And God said to Avram, then it would be just about us, whoever us turns out to be. But the Bible is aspiring to universality that I think Pirkei Avot is not. The ethics of the ancestors, which doesn't mean that it's not relevant and powerful. Jim?
Isn't chapter 20 up through whatever, a real subtle rebuke? You guys have had 400 years to get out of Egypt. You didn't do it, and look what you found yourself in. Now you better listen to me. Because otherwise, you're just not going to make it. There's no mention in all this of the fact that when they went to Egypt, they went because of a famine.
Yeah.
But they stayed 400 years.
Yes.
So isn't there some kind of rebuke here that you need my guidance because you have 400 years and you put yourself in a horrible situation. So now listen to me, I'll help you out.
I like your conclusion. I question your premise. You need my guidance. That's true. Why? There are two possibilities so far, I might say, more than that. One is, you blew it. You didn't take the opportunity to help yourselves. The other is, the forces outside of a particular community, the political forces, the military forces, reality, is such that it's hard for a community to be an autonomous director of its own destiny. You need help not because you didn't take advantage of your opportunity, but because reality is such. I think it's the latter and not what you're suggesting, though I think it might be worthwhile to explore the evidence for your point. After all, if we're living in a tyranny and a vast systemic, wealthy tyranny, how can a beleaguered people free itself, we might ask?
But what I'm saying is over the course of the 400, they didn't start out beleaguered. They had Joseph.
Right?
Before the demise of whoever the Pharaoh was that liked Joseph, if they'd have left, they'd have avoided, well, the whole book wouldn't be here, I guess, but nonetheless, it goes on to say, from line 4 on, it lists all the things that the Egyptians did. Don't do them.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true, don't do them. Yeah, Jeff?
I just want to take a slightly different view, which is these are the things you can do and remain people even if you live in a totalitarian regime, because the Lord knows we have.
Yes.
So if you're going to keep an identity of a community, and at this point maybe it's a particularly Jewish community, although these commandments apply elsewhere, but I think he's trying to define this community, and it is what will keep you a community under circumstances beyond your control, which could be totalitarian, whether it's Germany or anywhere else, diaspora.
So you're not responding to the question of why God needs to command us, but what we will need in the future in order to withstand tyranny or impediments.
And keep our end of the covenant.
And keep our end of the covenant. I think that's Jordan is pointing out that the camera is going to go off in a second. Thank you. And thank you for your attentiveness. Yeah. Well, we're at an interesting point. Let's put it this way. What I'd like to do next week is to continue to think about the Ten Commandments, not now in terms of their context and community orientation, but what kind of commandments are they how operative are they on their own? And therefore, what do they need to become real imperatives? Can you, thou shalt not murder? How? It doesn't tell me that. So what kind of commandment are we dealing with? Then I want to also look at the ways in which ethics suffuses other forms of biblical literature and not just through commandment. And I want to look at one particular narrative to point that out. And that's what we'll continue to do next week. Shabbat Shalom.